Alright, so it's been a bit longer than I was expecting, and I'm finally getting around to the follow-up video, well, one of the follow-up videos to my 3090 video, where I did mention that the memory runs pretty damn hot. So we're going to be going over that today, as well as some potential warnings to you guys. Okay, so starting off then, the memory on the stuff like the 3090 and the 3080 and possibly the 3080 Ti, that's currently unconfirmed, they use what's called GDDR6X, which is very similar to GDDR6, but it runs a hell of a lot faster, can overclock better, you get the idea. Now the problem with GDDR6X is it's not GDDR6. Now, I have a few results, so it should go ahead and hopefully be interesting, but out of all the GPUs in Nvidia's range, only the 3080 and the 3090 are actually armed with temperature sensors for the memory, which is something I find kind of interesting in the first place, the fact that they have them there, and as a result we can read them, and the problem is there's something quite troubling going on. Now, compared to AMD GPUs, Nvidia don't have many memory sensors. AMD GPUs have them all up and down the stack, which is ideal for these purposes. So getting on to what the actual problem is, GDDR6 and GDDR6X are rated for up to 95 degrees Celsius operating temperature, as stated by Micron on their website with all the information publicly available. Now, the problem is that on the 3090, the 3080, and basically between the two of them across multiple manufacturers, the memory often runs way over that. Now, I have been for a bit of time collecting data from various people that have AMD and Nvidia cards. We have both points of reference because obviously they're both using some form of GDDR6. Difference between one's 6X, one's 6, and this will become very relevant in a bit, but they both have the same max temperature. Now, out of, I think it was around about 20th results, about 10 for each. For AMD, the temperature range at which the highest temperature recorded by the memory sensor at the T junction, which is like the center of the die essentially, was 56 to 88 degrees Celsius across the entire range, across all, I think it was either 10 or 14. One was 10, one was 14. I can't remember if it was AMD or Nvidia. But comparatively speaking, on Nvidia's side, it's 78 degrees, so it's already a lot hotter, to 112 degrees C. Keep in mind, this is GDDR6X, so it's obviously going to be running faster, but you'd think they'd have compensated for that with the fact that this is running, well, in one case, what, 17 degrees over what it's supposed to be running, as stated by Micron, and I can't remember exactly where. I'll have to go ahead and pull up documentation, because I'm also pulling this up so I don't forget anything. But yeah, the absolute maximum that the memory is allowed to run at, well, not even run at, be stored at, is 125 degrees, and yet some of these GPUs are hitting literally just over 10 degrees below that, which is really not good considering that it's well over 10 degrees above what it's supposed to be running at, and it's closer to its storage temperature than it is to its actual usage temperature. Now, across both results for AMD and Nvidia, we've got 3080s, 3090s, 6900 XTs, 6800 XTs, 5700 XTs, and 5600 XTs. I couldn't get any 6800 results because, surprisingly, they're very hard to actually find people with 6800s, but I digress. Now, the actual mean average for AMD was around about 78.2 degrees, so you get that by adding up all the numbers and then dividing them by how many you have. Whereas on Nvidia it was 93.7, literally just less than 2 degrees, actually just barely over a degree really, than under its maximum rated operating temperature, which is kind of concerning considering these are 3080s, 3090s, brand new cards. They shouldn't be running so hot. Further sort of amplifying this point, the medium for AMD was 80 degrees Celsius, whereas on Nvidia it was 93 degrees Celsius. Again, very close to their mean results, as well as showing that the range is really kind of toasty. In fact, if I remember rightly, the next one over on Nvidia for the mean would have been 96 degrees, so it is literally half of them are running under, half of them are running over. And yeah, the other concerning thing is, of course, AMD, none of their chips are running hot. And I was going back to, they run GDDR6, not 6X. We're coming back to that now. And the reason why I feel that this is probably happening is that manufacturers, Nvidia included, probably are just using the exact same stuff they were using for GDDR6X on like the 2080 Ti in terms of thermal pads, thinking it's GDDR6 plus a bit more, a little bit hotter, probably thinking back to the way that it worked with GDDR5 and GDDR5X, and the fact that, yeah, 5X is hotter, but you can basically get away with a thermal pad, you don't necessarily need the highest quality ones. Now with GDDR6, that's actually not really how it works anymore, because GDDR6, it runs considerably hotter, and also it's running, if I remember rightly, at I think 1.35 or 1.5 volts. It's basically running at the same voltage as your RAM in your motherboard if you're using XMP. It is running insanely high voltages, plus the fact that it's running very fast and very hard, amplified by other things. It means that these chips run incredibly hot, and as a result of Nvidia, AMD, all the board partners just assuming that GDDR6X is going to run the same as GDDR6, it means that it's going to just run incredibly hot, to the fact that, as we're seeing here on Nvidia, where they haven't gone ahead and corrected for this and used a higher quality, more expensive thermal pad, probably to go ahead and try and cut some costs with the whole production and manufacture, that they probably didn't have any fancy ones on hand, and they probably don't want to pay the extra cost it would take to retool the factories that do make their thermal pads able to produce much higher quality ones. Which might go to explain a bit of the way why they are currently giving thermal pads that just aren't good enough. And whilst it is terrible, it's kind of worse if you're the consumer, because what this means for you is you've got a card here that half the time will be running fine when it's under load, but on the other half of the time it has the potential to basically go up to a temperature where the memory will not thermal throttle, but it'll cause the card itself to thermal throttle, so the memory will still pin itself at 110 degrees Celsius, but the card itself will then draw back its power limit to go ahead and not let it get as hot, which is still kind of concerning because it sort of circumvents the whole the way that it's supposed to thermally throttle. And I've noticed this from my own experimentation with my card, which of course I've done all the VRAM mods to cool it down. And what will happen is that when the card does reach this 110 degrees C absolute max before it thermally throttles, which I'm assuming is built probably into the card rather than into the memory, it seems to be then it will pull back the power until it will eventually slow down. So, well, eventually cool down to a point where it's supposed to run. But the problem is it doesn't actually cool down, because it's not taking, from what I can tell, a voltage or speed off the memory. The memory's still running as hot as it was before, it's just now the surrounding area is slightly cooler and there's less power going through it, but it's still going to be pinned at 110 degrees C, which means you may not even notice that your card is basically slowly baking itself to death, or at least the memory itself is baking itself to death because it doesn't have an idea. So yeah, I sort of wanted to bring this out as more of a public service announcement, because this is kind of worrying. Like, I have seen multiple videos of people noticing like that memory's running bloody hot. Like a Linus Tech Tip video when they would go ahead and saying, Jesus, that the actual temperature of the GPU die is the same as it was on the back of the actual, I think it was the back of the water block for water cooling, because the memory is just reaching that hot that it's heating up the back tremendously, and as a result that's translating throughout the card. So a large portion of this issue is going to be completely down to just the factor of use of poor quality thermal pads when they need to be using better ones. Now the other thing that is more than likely magnifying this is actual cooler design itself. Now with the GDDR6X, the actual silicon is much closer to the motherboard itself that it's sat on, rather than it is to the top of its own package. So putting thermal pads on the top, that's great. The problem is a lot of that heat is also being transferred straight into the motherboard, so what you also need to do is take that into account and go ahead and put thermal pads on the bottom of your motherboard, or on the opposite side. So when you've got something like, let's say, a 3090 with 24 gigs of VRAM, on both sides, of a motherboard like that, it sort of only amplifies the issue and the fact that the cooler designs really haven't caught up with the actual design here. Whilst they are definitely cooling the core, well, seriously, the actual core cooling on this, tremendous. It works flawlessly, despite some small glaring design issues. But with the amount of power it's pulling and the fact that it's running so cool, it's genuinely impressive what NVIDIA engineers have managed to do there. The problem is they haven't took into account the VRAM itself, and more to the point, protecting the VRAM as much as they should. Hence the reason why you see a lot of people saying they've done thermal pad mods, or they've gotten a new backplate and then put thermal pads on it, and they've noticed that the temperatures have dropped quite a lot, despite the fact they haven't touched the thermal pads on the memory itself. And that's because that's just how much heat is being deposited straight into the motherboard, and more than likely also shortening the life of some of the other components on there. So with my own testing, let's go ahead and show what kind of difference you can achieve using the exact same load and the exact same circumstances. My GPU's memory was hitting 110 degrees C, that's a 3090, and it was running at stock. Actually no, it was actually running at 75% power limit, so not even full. That is just as much power as about 1080 Ti 1080, and that was hitting 110 degrees Celsius. With just replacing the thermal pads that are on the GPUs, that's replacing the ones that's on the MOSFETs, VRMs, memory, as well as replacing all the ones on the back, and adding a bunch to the motherboard itself to go ahead and then transfer its heat into the backplate of the GPU. It then dropped from 110 degrees C to 86 degrees C, under the exact same load and the exact same circumstances. And even further still, once I added a couple of small heat sinks to the top of the backplate to go ahead and help give it more surface area to dissipate. But it's definitely a factor of, one, the poor thermal pads are ridiculously hampering the actual abilities of the cards, because they will overheat, they will cook themselves to death slowly over time. You may not notice it, you may wonder why am I getting such weird frame drops here and there, and you won't realise it's because the memory itself is overcooking. And what's worse still is, even if you do replace these thermal pads, there is still definitely a lot of room left in the actual cooler design that just leaves a lot to be desired. The fact that it's just not built in such a way that it really takes good account for how hot the memory gets. While sure, a lot of it will get transferred into the cooler, and the cooler will get very hot. It's not transferring it efficiently in the first place, and worse than that, the cooler just, despite its size, doesn't have enough cooling for everything. It's very good at cooling the core, it's very good at cooling half of the memory, but the other half is cooking itself off, and more than that, it's then depositing all that heat back into the motherboard. And despite the fact that it was just, a VRAM cooling mod using the same thermal paste that I was using before I changed it, it managed to save something like 5-10 degrees on the core itself, showing that just how much heat is being deposited into the motherboard. It's actually heating up the GPU core as well. So that's sort of what's going on with me, as well as what I've been trying to go ahead and get done. So yeah, if you do have a 3080 or 3090, do be aware that they may be running hot, and given the current situation of how hard to get cards out, at your own risk, I may potentially suggest change your backplate for one that can take some heat. So I have a friend who has a 3080 and they've gone ahead and replaced the backplate on that, as well as put some thermal pads on the back, and it has tremendously helped with cooling the actual memory on the opposite side, because it deposits a lot of the heat into the motherboard. Or if you feel that you are skilled enough and you've gone ahead and done your research and understand what's going on, you may also want to consider changing out the thermal pads yourself for much better ones. Because this isn't, as far as I can tell, this doesn't seem to be a fault really of the add-in board partners or really NVIDIA. I mean, sure, they have overlooked things, but it doesn't feel as if this is malicious. This generally just feels like they have overlooked the actual heat that GDDR6X pumps out, and as a result of them overlooking that, this is where we're at, where we're constantly seeing memory temperatures reach 110 degrees, over 100 degrees whilst gaming, when it just has no reason to. With good thermal pads and good cooler design, it could be so much dramatically lower, but because this hasn't really been taken into account, and it's probably not had to be thought of before, this is where we're at. So yeah, So if you do want to go ahead and consider fill pad replacement, I'll also be doing a video at some point soon where I've gone ahead and gone through the process of how that was modded, so you can go ahead and follow along at home if you do have a 3090. But that is it for this video. So like the video if you like it, dislike if you dislike it, any thoughts or questions, leave a form of a comment down below. Don't forget to check out my Discord, Facebook, Patreon, all that good stuff down in the description down below. And well, this has been the 117th con. Signing off, folks. Take care out there and keep an eye on your memory sensors. Until the next time, Sarah.